Hi, I'm Lauren Wilkinson, and I'm a senior policy researcher at the Pensions Policy Institute. And today I'm going to talk to you about how far the UK ESG landscape has come, the current state of play, and the direction we might be heading in. So, environmental, social, and governance, or ESG factors, are becoming an increasingly important consideration in pension schemes' investment strategies. As these issues are becoming more pressing, both in terms of being more widely recognised as material risks, as well as external pressures such as increased regulation and a broader societal focus. So we've seen climate change movements happening, such as Extinction Rebellion, and people are generally becoming more aware and engaged in the general population. So I'd like to take us back to the early years of ESG and responsible investment, back in the 1980s. And these ESG funds were predominantly focused on ethical rather than financial considerations at that time. And there was a perceived conflation between ESG and ethics that created some confusion for trustees and investors, and even a belief that ESG investment was in opposition to schemes' fiduciary duties to protect members from risks and secure the highest possible returns with their savings. Nevertheless, the focus on ESG and responsible investment continued to grow, due in part to concerns about the societal impact of ESG issues, but also because of concerns that not all schemes were necessarily investing in a way that prioritised the long-term sustainability of returns or accounted for long-term risks in as much as they could possibly do so. So, since 2000, we've seen a growing focus on the financial aspect of ESG and the way in which this interacts with schemes' legal duties. While the broader societal impacts of ESG investment are important in a universal sense, they're not the relevant component of ESG for pension schemes, which must focus on the aim of securing positive retirement outcomes for members. So this shift towards a greater focus on the financial risks associated with ESG has really brought it to the forefront of policy and industry. Over the last decade, and particularly the last couple of years, the UK ESG landscape has evolved rapidly, and the continued refocusing of ESG investment to financial risk mitigation, rather than the purely ethical concerns of the past, has been a vital part of this evolution. So in 2012, the K Review, which aimed to promote a greater focus on long-term impact of investment following the lessons that we learned from the global economic crash, highlighted that scheme trustees were generally focusing too heavily on the short term in terms of asset performance and perhaps neglecting consideration of some long-term risks, including environmental risks that form part of ESG. This was followed by two Law Commission reports in 2014 and 2017 that aimed to disentangle ethical components of ESG from the financially material risk component that needs to be considered by schemes. Both reports called for greater clarity and regulation to provide guidance to schemes that were struggling to understand their ESG obligations. And in the last 2 years, this evolution in the ESG landscape has sped up even more. So in 2018, the House of Commons Environmental Audit Committee published two reports, both calling for greater focus in sustainability and investing. And 2018 was also a big year for ESG at EU level, with the European Commission publishing regulations which aim to integrate ESG considerations in a consistent way across sectors. There was also the introduction of the Shareholders' Rights Directive 2, and a sustainable finance report establishing recommendations to make ESG investment easier across Europe. And of course, we've also seen increased SIP regulation relating to ESG considerations, with schemes now required to not only illustrate how they've considered ESG factors when designing their investment strategy, but also to produce an implementation statement that explains how they've followed and acted upon the stated investment principles set out in their SIP. And this includes monitoring and reporting on the way in which the scheme selects and retains its asset managers who undertake investment and engagement activities on its behalf. So we're now in a position where regulation is pushing pension schemes to increase their engagement with ESG issues. But while some schemes are doing a lot in this area of investment, we still have a long way to go before all schemes have integrated ESG risk factors to ensure that their members are adequately protected against longer-term risks. PPI's Engaging with ESG survey, which we conducted during November, found that 2 in 5 schemes had made changes to their investment portfolio following the regulatory changes, while 1 in 5 had not made changes yet, but are in the process of identifying the best approach for doing so. This leaves 37% of schemes who have added ESG considerations into their SIP in order to comply with regulation, but haven't made any changes to their investment portfolio, and they're not exploring ways in which to do so. Some of these schemes might have already integrated ESG into their investment strategy prior to the regulatory changes, and therefore they haven't needed to update their asset allocation. But for others, integration is likely limited. Many schemes in the survey acknowledge that implementation of their ESG strategy is a work in progress, so there's certainly still change happening, and more schemes moving towards a greater consideration of ESG risk factors, but it'll take some time for this process to work through, particularly for those schemes that aren't really engaging at all on ESG and weren't doing so prior to the regulatory changes. Changes in regulation, as well as the increasingly imminent risk presented by some ESG factors, have pushed many trustees and providers to improve their knowledge and understanding of ESG issues. However, there's still a clear knowledge gap in some areas of the industry. Data clarity and accessibility can also act as a barrier. With a vast number of ESG metrics and analytics tools available, it can be hard for schemes to know which data is most appropriate for their needs and how different tools relate to one another. This is one of the key challenges coming out of responses to the Engaging with ESG survey, with more than a quarter citing too much information as a challenge, and 22% saying that conflicting information has been a challenge as well. So, considering these barriers and some schemes being slower than others to integrate ESG considerations, there's a question as to whether there's a need for clearer practical guidance and support on ESG, whether from government or industry. We're also likely to see an increased focus on social and governance issues, where previously much of the focus has been around environmental and especially climate change issues, although climate change will continue to be a strong and even increased focus going forward. But the rapid change we've observed in recent years in ESG investment doesn't look set to slow down, making it all the more important that schemes are supported to appropriately integrate these material risks into their investment portfolio. Some of this evolution will happen organically, with those schemes that are more engaged and perhaps have greater levels of resource and expertise, pushing this forward and creating more opportunities and insight for schemes that might be lagging behind. Other schemes might need greater support or guidance from government and industry to fully integrate an appropriate ESG strategy. And those schemes that are still struggling to recognise the financial importance of integrating ESG risks may need a stronger push. Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to know more about ESG, please go to the PPI website and look at our Engaging with ESG research series.